Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of History 20, and welcome to the very first lecture in the course. This class is a history of the 20th century, and in lectures to come for the rest of the quarter, we'll be examining the key cardinal central developments of the 20th century. But in this first lecture, we're going to back up a little bit and traverse the late 18th and the 19th century and examine some key antecedents, some key developments within global culture, global politics, the global economy that proved to be so important in shaping the 20th century that is our focus in this class. So starting in our next lecture, we'll begin in the early 20th century and for the rest of the quarter, traverse the 1900s. But in this first lecture, we're going to back up, talk about the late 18th, 19th centuries, and examine some developments within those time periods that, as we'll see, will prove to be very important and formative in the making of the 20th century. So let's dive in to this look at these key antecedents. We begin by tracing economic antecedents. By the way, antecedent is just a fancy $4 word we PhD types throw around for something that came before. So again, in this lecture, we're talking about trends of the late 18th, 19th century that would later become so important and formative in the 20th century, things that came before the 20th century, hence that fancy $4 word antecedent. And we begin here with some economic antecedents, some developments in the global economy in the century prior to 1900 that, as we'll see, will be very important in the story of the 20th century. As we will see in lectures to come, the 20th century is very much about the expansion of industrialization, how a global economy will shift in fits and starts in incomplete ways from one focused on agriculture to one increasingly focused on mass production of manufactured goods. That's a way of understanding industrialization. People living in cities, working in factories, producing industrial goods. That trend of industrialization began far before the 20th century, though it will greatly expand in the 20th century. Hence, it is one of these antecedents. It began in parts of Western Europe and the United States in the late 1700s, the late 18th century. The slow but steady shift towards an industrial-based economy, where people, in large-scale ways, mass-produce manufactured goods for sale to markets within nations and around the globe, that spread of industrialization. That begins in the late 1700s, it further expands in the 1800s, and as we'll see, it will become a global economic phenomenon in the 20th century. Parts of the Industrial Revolution concern the harnessing of new technologies to mass produce these manufactured goods. New forms of machine power were vital to this shift in the global economy towards mass production. Things like the steam engine, invented and perfected by various tinkerers in the late 1700s, would prove to be key in the shift towards industrialization, allowing for the mass production of goods, harnessing new forms of power that were vital and key to this form of manufacturing and factory production. So you have a form of machine power fueled by new inventions like the steam engine and later other forms of machinery that could make this possible. There are many effects of this transition beyond just economics. This led to a decline of artisan labor. It led to a decline in bespoke, custom-made goods that would once be made on a local scale by artisans, the cobbler who makes your shoes, the tailor who makes your clothes, and instead that labor was now being performed by machines operated by individuals. That led to a delocalization of labor. It led to an abstraction of labor where now you never see the person who makes the shoes you wear, the clothes you wear, who may be toiling away in a factory hundreds, eventually thousands of miles away. So this new industrial economy that came with machine power has a number of key consequences, many of which we still see today. The clothes you're right now wearing, the food you'll later eat for lunch or dinner, the car that you used to drive to campus, likely produced outside the United States, by forms of production and a global economy that has now created this abstraction of labor on a global scale. So machine power allowed for mass production, and it had such effects like the decline of localized labor and the decline of artisan labor. Now it was an era of the ready-made, where abstract goods were produced, the labor behind them was abstracted, and then you, the consumer, who will later purchase them, are also abstracted in key ways. Also important to the story of industrialization was an interrelated revolution, the transportation revolution, which also began in certain parts of the globe in the late 1700s and then flourished in the 19th century, in the 1800s. For thousands of years, there's absolutely no change in the ways in which goods, people, and ideas circulate. From the era of Alexander the Great in ancient Greece through the American Revolution in the late 1700s, there's absolutely no change in terms of transportation technology. The only forms of transportation that existed through those thousands of years for human beings, animal power, whether it was from animals themselves or the human animal, or wind power, getting in a boat, waiting for the wind to blow. And then in the late 1700s and early 1800s, you get this explosion of new forms of technology in regards to transportation, truly revolutionary, a revolution related to another revolution, the transportation revolution being vital to the industrial revolution. In the late 1700s, early 1800s, you have things like steamboats. You have the construction of roads, canals throughout the industrial world. And then eventually, in the early 19th century, the technology that will so transform human life in that century, the locomotive. And so for thousands of years, no change. For thousands of years, no change in terms of how goods, people, and ideas circulate. From the era of Alexander the Great through the era of Benjamin Franklin, those men knew nothing faster than a horse. And then all of a sudden you get steamboats and roads and canals and locomotives. By the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century, the automobile, subways, all sorts of new ways of moving goods, people, and ideas faster than ever before. Some of this has economic effects we've already spoken to in regards to industrialization. This allowed goods, mass-produced in urban areas, to be sold to nationwide and eventually global-wide markets. This meant that you could now reach consumers hundreds, thousands of miles away. It created a larger marketplace for those industrial goods. It made the distant now close. Also, this transportation revolution had cultural effects. What once seemed unbridgeable, unspannable, now seemed to be at one's fingertips. It changed our perception of the natural world. No longer were human beings slave to nature, but instead nature was a slave to us in the sense that we could now blow up mountains and send railroads right through them. We could now divert the course of rivers. Nature seemed to bend to our designs, and this led to a sensibility in a part of the world being transformed by industrialization, the transportation revolution, that anything was possible through this new power of science, reason, and technology. So though in this lecture we're talking about economic antecedents, cultural antecedents, political antecedents, things that came before that will prove to be so key and consequential in making the 20th century, these developments don't fit into nice, tidy containers. What was economic was often cultural. What was cultural was often political. And these economic developments, namely an industrial revolution, a new economy centered on the mass production of goods, had cultural effects in the decline of artisan labor, the prestige that local artisans once had, the abstraction of human beings and their labor. Transportation revolution also had cultural effects in urging us to believe in new ways in regards to the potential of human beings in a natural world, the ways in which we came to see science as powerful and transformative as it made these roads, canals, steamboats, and locomotives. Another key economic antecedent developing in certain parts of the world concerned farming. Yes, certain parts of the global economy were increasingly centered on industrialization, but people still need to eat. And so farming remained a mainstay of a global economy, but the way farming is centered, organized, is changing in certain parts of the world, particularly in the more industrial parts of the world like Western Europe and the United States in the late 18th and 19th century with the rise of the market revolution, yet another revolution in this age of revolutions, and we've only scratched the surface in regards to how revolutionary the 19th century truly was. The market revolution, the development of a market economy in regards to farming, concerned how and where farming often took place. The where, often in areas now connected to population centers through the transportation revolution. So you might have rural areas in parts of Europe and the United States, but they were connected to urban areas through railroads, steamboats, and canals. But it's the how that's almost more important in regards to the market revolution, how farming changed. With the market revolution, farmers in these parts of the world where the market revolution is beginning in the late 18th and 19th century now focused growing crops in surplus amounts. This is the decline of subsistence farming, where farmers grew crops that they themselves would consume. You plant wheat and you eat that wheat. Surplus farming, growing surplus crops, means you are trying to maximize your yield. You're trying to grow as much wheat as possible, confident that that excess wheat, the wheat that you cannot consume, can be sold at market, shipped to people on steamboats and railroads, and be turned into cash. The market revolution regarded growing surplus crops, excess crops, more food than you could ever eat, and selling those surplus crops for cash and using that cash to buy things that you may have once produced on your own but are now being produced in manufacturing sites around a nation or around the globe. So farmers would now focus all of their attention on growing one crop, perhaps, rather than allocating resources for the production of other resources. They would instead often invest in a monocultural approach to farming, growing one crop, because they could sell that crop and then turn around and buy shoes, candles, books, furniture, mass-produced, again, in a new industrial economy. So this too is interrelated with industrialization and the transportation revolution, the market revolution, a shift in farming with an emphasis on commercial farming, surplus crops. This encouraged farmers to adopt machines that could maximize yield, new techniques of agriculture that could produce more and more food. Rather than see that food spoil, you could now ship it and see it instead turn into profits that you could use to buy manufactured goods. So farmers, though they were in rural areas and not involved in industrialization in terms of working for wages and producing manufactured goods, were deeply connected to this new age of machine power as they embraced reapers and steel-tip plows and new irrigation techniques and tractors that allowed them to again maximize their yield and sell that excess crop they could never consume, for cash to distant markets. One of the effects of this was a decline in agricultural labor in the parts of the world experiencing this market revolution, because you could now grow more and more food with fewer and fewer people. You didn't need so many hands on the farm, as those hands were replaced by machines. Where did those people go when their labor was no longer needed? Well, they went to cities to work in factories. So again, hopefully you can see how, like tiles on a roof, all of these trends we're talking about that are developing in certain parts of the world in the late 18th and 19th century are deeply connected. The Industrial Revolution, a new age of mass production, manufacturing, a transportation revolution, a new age not just of new ways of moving goods, people, and ideas around, but new forms of communication that also developed in the 19th century, telegraphs and later telephones, and a market revolution, a change in how and where agricultural products are produced. Some of the effects of this increasingly were great disparities in wealth and power in industrial nations, where figures who controlled these new technologies, these new resources, were able to increasingly build up wealth, concentrate power. By the late 19th century in places like Europe and the United States, you have these titans of industry who have these vast monopolies who control great capital and power and have great authority as a result. One of the effects of the Industrial Revolution was, again, the disparities that develop in terms of economic power and with it often political power as well. Much like today, those who control certain technologies are able to amass great wealth in our internet age. We saw that in the 18th and 19th century in these new technologies of industrialization. These new technologies of transportation as railroad magnates consolidate their wealth and power. And so the industrial economies, the industrial societies that are developing in the late 18th and 19th century tend to be societies of haves and have-nots. And we will see the effects of that in this class in very, very stark terms when industrialization becomes increasingly the rule around the globe. How with industrialization come these great disparities in wealth that often serve as springboards for political revolutions. So many of the key events that we'll see in the 20th century. With industrialization and its method of mass production, you necessarily had to agglomerate a large population of people in certain areas. You have the rise of cities, urbanization. Now, of course, cities have existed throughout human history for thousands and thousands of years before industrialization. But industrialization, because of its method of mass production, because it often relied early on with steam power on access to rivers and waterways, it tended to concentrate this form of economic activity in certain areas. As a market revolution was sweeping through the agricultural economies of these parts of the world, and again displacing people from farm labor as their work was now replaced by the labor of machines, those people headed to cities where they found work now in factories, and you have the rise of cities as again connected to all of these trends: industrialization, the transportation revolution. The transportation revolution allowed people to agglomerate in cities where they were focused on industrialization. How did they eat? How did they satisfy that basic human need? Well, food was brought in on steamboats and railroads and later automobiles from rural areas thanks to the transportation revolution. So again, all of these trends deeply connected. Urbanization, this concentration of manufacturing in certain areas, another key development in certain parts of the world in the 18th and 19th century. Here in the United States, in 1800, the beginning of the 19th century, most people lived in rural areas and were involved in farming. By the end of the 19th century, as our story of the 20th century begins in 1900, most Americans lived in cities and worked in factories. So urbanization, also a key trend in the economy in the 18th and 19th centuries. And then, as we'll see, in the 20th century, the urban experience tends to become increasingly a global experience with the development of urban areas around the globe, the development of metropolises and megalopolises, and that too becomes a defining characteristic of global life in the 20th and now 21st century. With all of these trends, you have changes in how people are working, where they are working, and what sort of labor they are doing. Another one of the economic trends of the 18th and 19th century, connected to all of these revolutions, the Industrial Revolution, the Market Revolution, the Transportation Revolution, the Communication Revolution, a fluidity of labor. Labor migrating and moving from rural areas to urban areas, around the globe in the 20th century, as we'll see as these trends begin to envelop the globe. So you have a much more fluid labor force in terms of the movement and mobilization of people, goods, and ideas circulating in ways never seen before. You have mass immigration. For example, here in the United States, tens of millions of people come to the United States as immigrants in the 19th century, in the 1800s, in an age where here in the United States we had open borders where anyone could come, and if you were white, you could become a citizen. In the 1800s, here in the United States, as we were deeply involved in these trends of industrialization, urbanization, millions of people come here as immigrants in an age of open borders where anyone who wanted to come could come. And if you were white, you could become a citizen, something we should be very mindful of in the current immigration debate where you'll hear people say, well, my ancestors came here legally. Well, no shit. It was impossible to come here illegally prior to 1924. You didn't accomplish anything. What do you want, a cookie or something, right? In the 1800s, anyone could come. And if you were white, you could become a citizen. And that's very demonstrative of trends in the United States, but around the world in the industrial age, where you see mass mobilization and movement of people to urban areas to work in factories. Those people who may have once been employed in farming now find themselves living in a city, working in a factory, and with it comes another major trend and change in economics in this period. Another trend that will increasingly become a global experience in the 20th century, wage labor. Now, we take this for granted, this idea of selling your time for money. To us, it seems normal and natural. It's how your grandparents made a living, it's how your parents made a living, and it's how you largely anticipate you making a living. Selling your time for money, for wages or a salary, which is just the same thing, basically. It even explains what the hell you're doing right now, listening to this lecture, when you would much rather be doing something else like Netflix and chilling your day away, right? But you find yourself listening to a maniac like me yell at you about these antecedents. The reason why you're in this class is that you realize that the best way to maximize your wage in the now 21st century is to earn a college degree. So this is very natural to us. It's how our parents made a living, how our grandparents made a living. It's very natural to you because it explains what the hell you're doing right now in this class, in this moment. But for human beings in the late 18th and 19th century, this was new, this idea of selling one's time for money, the advent of wage labor. And for many, it was very troubling. It led to, again, a decline in an older order. It marked an abrupt and often dislocating change, and many of the great clashes in the industrial world in the 19th century concerned this transition to wage labor. But like so many of these trends, wage labor, though troubling and new and often dislocating, was here to stay, as evident by the fact that we still orient our economic lives around this transaction to this very day, hence again, your presence in this class. But with wage labor came this transition, and we have to rightfully see it as something not natural, not the way that human beings of the 19th century, their parents and grandparents made a living, something new, something novel, something revolutionary. So you get all these trends in the 19th century, and they develop in certain pockets around the globe and then become part of a global experience of the 20th century, and all of humanity, in many ways touched by these trends, will wrestle with the consequences of things like wage labor, as we will see in our survey of the 20th century. At the heart of all of these economic trends and developments in the 18th and 19th century was technology. And so in this slide, I want to dedicate some time to enunciating the various inventions, new forms of technology that developed in this period that, as we'll see, will spread around the globe in the 20th and now early 21st century. This was a time of remarkable, disruptive, convulsive, revolutionary change in our material worlds. This is part of the remarkable, revolutionary trends of modernity, the variety of new inventions that made their way into the human experience in the late 18th and 19th century, deeply connected, of course, to industrialization, the market revolution, the transportation revolution, were these inventions that developed in this period, spread throughout the globe, and proved to be so formative and influential not just in economic terms, but in cultural, social terms as well. So let's examine just a smattering of examples of new technologies that developed in this period that had such a concussive effect. Now, we like to imagine today, as we live in the 21st century, that we live in an age of such remarkable technological change as we all walk around with our smartphones yelling into our smart speakers. For such a dumb society that we have, we sure insist on naming everything smart, right? The other day I saw a guy in a smart car talking on a smartphone, drinking smart water. He looks so stupid, you know. So today we all like to congratulate ourselves. Ooh, I tweeted something, right? Or I'm, viewing a YouTube video like this one. We live in such a remarkable age. Oh my goodness, it's so very different than previous periods. Well, as much as we like to imagine we live in such an age of transformative technological change, you can make a much better argument, I would posit, that those human beings who came of age in the early 19th century in parts of the world that were undergoing these economic trends, these economic revolutions, that they, much more than us, lived in the most remarkable period of technological change, because in one generation, in the early 19th century, in Western Europe, in the United States, you see this cluster, this constellation of new technologies that so changed how and where we worked, how we imagined our place in relation to nature, and the possibilities of the human experience. I mentioned earlier the steam engine, invented and perfected in the late 18th and early 19th century. This transformed human life in so many ways. It was at the heart of the mass production, the industrial production, as steam engines powered spinning jennies and power looms and made the factory systems of industrialization possible. The steam engine powered steamboats and again connected distant markets, moved people, goods, and ideas in ways never seen before, made the distant now close, annihilated the limits of space and time. No longer a slave to nature. When previously you had to get in a boat and wait for the wind to blow, you could now decide where and when you navigate the waters of the natural world. Steam engine, by the mid-19th century, was harnessed to power locomotives, making railroads the most important technology of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The railroad was to the 1800s what the computer has been to us in the late 20th and now 21st century. It was that transformative. It changed everything. And powering that locomotive was the steam engine. In the late 18th century, Eli Whitney, a tinkerer here in the United States, invented a machine that could mass harvest cotton in ways never seen before, annihilating the previous laborious process of harvesting cotton by hand. The cotton gin had a huge effect on global history in ways that are quite tragic, because it revived the slave economy here in the United States and transitioned that slave economy from one that had been previously focused on the cash crop of tobacco to the cash crop of cotton. This led to an agglomeration of wealth in the United States. On the eve of the Civil War, the wealthiest Americans in this country weren't factory owners in northern cities or railroad magnates. They were slave owners from the South. The slave population here in the United States in 1860, on the eve of the American Civil War, was worth billions of dollars. Human beings held as slaves. You're reading in the first book in this class the story of Jack Johnson, who was born into the first free generation of African Americans whose parents had been enslaved. The cotton gin and the way in which it allowed a transition in American slavery and revived slavery at a point in which it was dying out in northern states who were swept up in the trend of industrialization is a technology of this period that had key and remarkable effects in terms of the global economy. The United States produced 75% of the global supply of cotton on the eve of the Civil War, but it also had terrible and tragic effects on the lives of millions of human beings who would be born into the cotton kingdom of the American South and find their lives relegated to one of bondage, subject to violence, deprivations, and eventually leading to that ruinous civil war at the midpoint of the 19th century. So many of these technologies had these very tragic human effects. Cyrus McCormick was an American tinkerer inventor who invented a reaper that would bear his name and transform the American economy as well, allowing for a market revolution and the mass harvesting of wheat with all the effects of the market revolution, the cash crop focus of agriculture that we enunciated on the previous slide. Not only did McCormick invent the reaper that would bear his name and help transform the American economy and be at the heart of that market revolution, he also invented a way of selling the reapers that was very novel and would also have key effects on a global economy in the 19th and 20th century. He sold his reapers on time. He sold them on credit, where people could borrow the money to buy the reaper, have it now, and then pay it off over time. So he, in many ways, invented consumer credit, the credit card of the 19th century. So Cyrus McCormick, a key influence on trends, all as a product of his invention of a machine and a methodology for selling that machine. Not as sexy, not as obviously transformative as a steam engine or a cotton gin, but perhaps even more important is the invention of interchangeable parts in the 19th century, where you could produce uniform replacement parts for these machines. New inventions, new lathes, new machines could cut and manufacture, fabricate replacement parts that could be used if a part on a machine broke. This is interchangeable parts. Prior to this, if you bought a gun in the 18th, early 19th century, it was often made custom for you from a local gunsmith. And if a part broke off on that gun, well, the entire gun was useless because you couldn't just run to the store and buy a replacement for that. Interchangeable parts changed that, because now there were uniform parts available to fix your gun, your McCormick Reaper, by the end of the 19th and early 20th century, your automobile. And the effect of this was to encourage a transition towards an industrial economy, to encourage people in making investments, often through borrowing in these expensive and complicated machines. If you bought a machine, and if one part broke off, the entire machine was useless, well, you wouldn't spend a great deal of money on that machine. If you bought an automobile, a $20,000 car, and when the water pump breaks on that car, the entire car is useless, well, this thing's worthless, let me just push it into the ocean, you wouldn't spend $20,000 on a car. If you buy a car, if you spend $20,000 on a car today and the water pump breaks, you can go to AutoZone and buy a replacement, or take it to a repair shop and the mechanic can buy that replacement and drive it home later that day. And that makes you more inclined to buy a $20,000, $30,000, or $40,000 car. Interchangeable parts made the industrial machine power revolutions we've been talking about possible. So again, on its surface, it doesn't seem to be as sexy and exciting as some of these other inventions, but interchangeable parts, this ability to mass produce replacement parts, the invention of these lathes and other cutting devices was key to fueling the industrial revolution and all of its effects. Typewriter was invented in the early 19th century. Again, all of this is happening within one generation. The human beings who came of age in the industrial part of the world in the early 1900s lived through the most technologically transformative period in human history, much more so than our 21st century, where it seems like all of our technologies are devoted to distracting us and making us buy more crap. Well, in the early 19th century, you have the steam engine, the steamboat, the locomotive, the cotton gin, the McCormick Reaper, the typewriter, which allowed ideas to circulate. It created a greater uniformity of language. It bound together people in a common set of symbols, allowing information, communication to spread, ideas to spread in ways never possible before. By the late 19th century, in urban areas, you had mass production of newspapers, where as you walked to your job in a factory, you could choose from a variety of broadsheet newspapers for a few pennies and read about stories from distant parts of the nation and world, binding together the community of people as one body of receivers of information. And we're going to talk a lot in this class about mass media, journalism, the circulation of ideas, fake news in the early 20th century and its effects. And all this again comes out of the ability to mass produce written words, circulate them as a product of things like the typewriter and the uniformity of script. You have the invention of the revolver by Samuel Colt in the early 19th century. The revolver could allow you to fire 6 shots without having to reload. It was lightweight. It was dependable. Replacement parts could be found. This was truly revolutionary, one of the many revolutionary technologies of this period, because it allowed a mortal human being to have the power over life and death. The 6-shot revolver allowed you to fire 6 shots quickly without reloading. So if you missed the first time, you still got 5 more bullets. It put on the hips of people around the world this technology that granted them great power over life and death. We're going to talk in this class about the bloodiest century in human history, the 20th century. We're going to talk about wars, genocide, all those happy events of the 20th century. And a lot of that was fueled by these new technologies that made such mass death and destruction possible, where common people, farm boys, shopkeepers, would find themselves on the Western Front in World War I, manning machine guns, manning tanks. That began, too, in the early 19th century, in these technological antecedents, in things like the production of Samuel Colt's revolver. It was said of Samuel Colt and his revolver, God made man, Samuel Colt made them all the same size. Because now, if you're a short little shrimp like me, and some big guy, 6'5", 300 pounds, comes after you, well, chances are he's going to beat the hell out of you, right? But if he comes after me, and I pull out a gun, does it matter how big he is? This is a good example of how technology changes natural advantages, the natural world. God made man. Samuel Colt made them all the same size. So the revolver, a key technology and indicative of, again, some trends in the 19th and through the 20th century that will change our thought about the power of human beings in an increasingly unnatural world and greater power over life and death. The image we have here is of Charles Daguerre. On this slide, you see an image of Charles Daguerre, who was one of the innovators of a truly revolutionary technology of the 19th century, the daguerreotype, a form of early photography. Photography develops, I guess that's the right verb, in the early 19th century in various parts of the world. Not one individual invented photography. Charles Daguerre was one of many individuals who were tinkering, experimenting with this remarkable technology that allowed human beings to capture and arrest time. The image we have here is one of the first examples of a photograph known as a daguerreotype, named after Charles Daguerre, where he experimented with this technology, taking a photograph of himself. You can think of this image on the slide as the very first selfie, where even then human beings were so self-centered and solipsistic. What did Charles Daguerre do when he had this remarkable technology to capture and arrest time? Well, he took a picture of himself, right? So this is very demonstrative of how Human beings, even in the 19th century, were obsessed with themselves, as we all now run off and take a million selfies of ourselves on the iPhones of today. Well, that technology that we take for granted, photography, also one of the remarkable developments in this remarkable period of the early 19th century. We do take photography for granted. We do all walk around with these smartphones, oh, they're so smart, and take dozens, maybe more photographs each and every day. We have such a lackadaisical attitude towards photography today because it is so cheap and accessible. We take these photographs. If we don't like them, we could delete them. Ooh, my ass looks big in this. Boop. It just evaporates off into the ether and we never think about it again. But we should think about it because that technology of photography that we all hold in our hands, that we now take for granted, is a technology that grants us human beings a time machine. That's really what a photograph is. It is the power to arrest, capture, and hold time still for a moment. Think about how many human beings over thousands of years fantasized about that ability. And now, thanks to Charles Daguerre and others, human beings in the 19th century had that ability to hold in their hands a time machine. Not only was the natural world bending to our designs as we blew up mountains and sent railroads right through them, diverted the course of rivers, made the distant now close. Another seemingly abstract natural force beyond our command, that of time, was now indeed under our command thanks to this invention of photography. Other inventions of this period, the sewing machine. It might seem outmoded and old-fashioned to us, something out of an old movie, something your grandmother may have utilized. In our now global economy of the 21st century, we don't tend to use sewing machines much anymore other than for the novelty of it, or perhaps to make something really special, or to make it big on Etsy. The sewing machine has gone that way in a new age where you can walk into any Walmart and buy a $4 t-shirt, right? Why make your own shirt other than novelty or for your own personal business when you can go into Walmart and buy a t-shirt for $4? But the sewing machine in this period of the early 19th century was truly revolutionary, and it was key in industrialization because the very first factories in human history, those that developed in Great Britain in the late 1700s, here in the United States in the early 1800s, focused on taking cotton, often produced in the American South by slaves, and turning it into textiles for sale. The very first industries in human history focused on cotton textiles, mass-producing clothing for humanity and selling it to distant markets. And what fueled that, in addition to steam engines and other trends of this period, was the sewing machine. In 1844, a man who's often referred to as the American Leonardo, Samuel Finley Breeze Morse. He's known as the American Leonardo because he dabbled in a variety of different pursuits. He wasn't just an inventor, he was a great painter, a writer, a philosopher. Samuel Morse was indeed a Renaissance man of sorts, but he's best known for his invention of the telegraph in 1844 at the midpoint of this 19th century, which allowed for ideas to circulate in ways never seen before. The telegraph was to the 19th century what the internet has become for us in the 20th and now 21st century. It allowed ideas and information to be sent over hundreds, eventually thousands of miles. It bound people together in a common marketplace for goods where you could buy and sell through impulses sent along telegraph wires. What Amazon is to us today, where with a few keystrokes they'll drop a package at your front door a few hours later, that's what the telegraph allowed human beings to do in the 19th century. So again, how advanced are we truly? Today when we send a text message, we're basically just sending a telegraph message. It's the same thing, electronic impulses sent along wires. What we might see as so modern, our text message culture, was really possible for human beings as far back as 1844 with the invention of the telegraph. Morse also invented a system, a code for transmitting ideas. Today, when you send that text message with today's forms of expression, LOL, FFS, whatever it may be, WTF, you're basically just sending a text message on the Morse code of the 21st century. So again, this period, the early 19th century, arguably the most technologically transformative in human history, where all this developed for the first time, and its effects can continue to be felt in the 20th and now 21st century. Railroads, we've talked a great deal about, but should be recognized as the key technology of the 19th century, spreading throughout the globe in the 20th century, in its ability to fuel all of these trends in the economy and the social and cultural effects that come with them. By the end of the 19th century, in addition to the telegraph, you had the telephone, new forms of communication that bound together human beings in new ways. So all of this happens in the span of just a couple of generations. New technologies that change how we live, where we live, what we do for a living, the way in which goods, people, and ideas circulate, and the net effect of this, a new age where we could capture and arrest time, where we could blow up mountains and send railroads right through them, where the limits of space and time now seem to be annihilated. All of this had a huge impact on perceptions, on cultural values. More than just physical objects, this changed sensibilities. It seemed to indicate that a new age of science and reason and technology was dawning as these inventions and technologies sweep across the globe in the 20th century. They have these effects in changing perception of time, perception of the natural world. They have the effect of auguring for remarkable change. So we're talking about formative and key technologies of this period, but all these technologies have effects beyond just the material goods themselves. We're going to talk a lot in lectures to come about how when the 20th century begins, human beings, particularly in parts of the world that had been transformed by these trends in the economy, industrialization, urbanization, those human beings who had their lives transformed by these technologies came to place great faith in a new century, the 20th century, that seemed to crackle with such promise. A new century where science and reason and technology seemed to offer the potential of creating a new and better world. Now, spoiler alert, it doesn't exactly work out that way, and as I've already indicated, the 20th century is a century instead of war, revolution, genocide, the bloodiest century in human history. We know that as we look back on that century here with hindsight. But when the 20th century began, there is great hope that the problems of humanity could be solved, that a new and better world could develop. We're going to talk a lot about those faiths, those hopes in a better world, and all that came from these revolutionary changes in the material world, the potential and possibilities of these technologies. The automobile. In the early 20th century, what began as a new technology of the late 19th century would expand and so transform life in the 20th century. Now, again, an individual seemed to be able to go where he or she wanted to go when they wanted to go. The automobile was a modern marvel that came out of the late 19th, early 20th century, expanded, and again seemed to augur for so many possibilities in a new 20th century that granted to individuals this autonomous methodology of moving, of transporting oneself, connecting oneself to a larger, more modern experience. We talked about the revolutionary impact of photography, but by the late 19th, early 20th century, you could now capture motion. You could project it onto a screen. Talk about something that today we take for granted as we all walk around on those devices watching movies or YouTube videos. We take it for granted, but in the late 19th century, this new technology, this ability to capture and arrest not just an image but motion, seemed to again really indeed augur for dramatic change into a new 20th century where anything could be possible. So cinema too, a key invention of the 19th century, freighted and loaded with all of this cultural impact and possibility. As I alluded to at the end of that previous slide, the changes in the global economy, the changes in technology that we've been examining in the late 18th and 19th century had key cultural impacts and effects. So in this slide, let's talk about cultural antecedents, developments within the global culture that often again come out of the trends we've already enunciated, that also will be very important and formative in the history of the 20th century. We have talked about how, with all of these developments, these remarkable technologies, their ability to grant power over the natural world to human beings, this changed how we thought, our values, our ideals, the realm of culture. It created a great faith and possibility of change, progress. And we're going to talk a lot as we examine the 20th century in the weeks ahead of clashing, contradictory visions of progress. As I've already indicated, as we'll dive deeper into, when the 20th century begins in 1900, there's great hope that the problems that plagued humanity could be eradicated, that we could create a better, even perfect world here on Earth, harnessing the power and magic of technology. So when the 20th century begins, after a century predating it, these antecedents of technological change, when the 20th century begins, there's great hope in a global culture in areas around the world that if we harness this technology, a better world, even a perfect world, is possible. The new technologies granted to human beings power, possibilities that again had stood simply as fantasy, as the realm of speculation for human civilizations and populations prior. And then this concussive power of modernity, and beyond just the physical, material technologies of change, came these cultural values that spawned great hope, great aspirations for progress. Now, again, spoiler alert, we don't get progress in the 20th century, quite the opposite. But that century began with great hope. And so what came before, the technological effects, had these cultural impacts, and it led to this great faith in progress. And the 20th century is a story that, as we'll see, is indeed marked by human misery, global conflicts, genocide. But behind a lot of those trends was a hope that certain pathways could be followed that could pursue a better world. As we'll talk about soon, when World War I begins, there was a great hope that it would be the war to end all wars. The American president who will urge his nation into that conflict will say, we must fight this world to make the world safe for democracy. So even when humanity finds itself embroiled in the destructiveness of war, there's this great faith that even through war, a better world is possible. So the realities of the 20th century, doom, misery, death, and despair, are deeply connected to the hope and possibilities of the 20th century. These great aspirations for progress, many of which were again germinated and spawned by technological change. In 1829, dictionaries of the English language for the first time offer a new definition for a new word coined for this moment. We create the language we need. We invent words to express the lived reality that we all encounter every day. We've seen this in our own time, right? The word like has a very different meaning today than it did 10, 20 years ago. It used to mean having a strong fondness for something. But now when you like something, it involves clicking a button, right? The word friend has changed in the last few years, last decade or so. A friend used to be an actual human being you saw, interacted with. But now, of course, a friend pixels on a screen, your Facebook friend. And I get it. Those Facebook friends are a lot better than actual friends. Actual friends are sometimes a pain in the ass, right? A friend in need is a problem, right? A friend in need is a pest, right? They're always borrowing your stuff, stealing your boyfriend, right? So I understand the preference for a Facebook friend. But when today we use that term friend, it's the Facebook friend, meaning that tends to be most salient. And so we've changed our vocabulary, our language in the 21st century to reflect technological change. And that too can be seen in this period of technological change, the early 19th century, where a brand new word entered the English dictionary, dictionaries of the English language, technology. And when technology was coined in 1829, it did not simply refer to new things, new inventions, new machines. It didn't just have a descriptive impact and meaning. Technology from the very beginning was freighted with the vision and meaning of progress. It wasn't just new stuff, it was new stuff that makes life better, new stuff that changes things for the good. When we use the term technology today, it's still in many ways freighted with that things that are new are better. Things that are new make life better. Those in the modern global economy have been conditioned to believe that. That's why when you buy the latest iPhone, as soon as you leave Best Buy, you got to walk right back in and get it updated, right? Because you always have to have the latest technology because we believe that somehow new is better. Well, that has been part of the human experience since the early 19th century, where this new word was coined to not only describe our lived reality, but to communicate a vision of that lived reality as one that was inherently better. We are going to talk a lot about clashing visions of progress. We're going to talk about a lot of prophets of change who will manifest and develop in the 20th century and say, "Follow me. I know the way to progress." We will even see how moments of death and destruction can be couched and expressed as moments of possibility for progress and change. These cardinal central developments of the 20th century. And we can understand that. We can understand that very deep and important element of the 20th century, the story of possibility, progress, narratives of change, by understanding again these antecedents, the new technologies that developed in the century prior to our focus in this class, and the way in which those new technologies changed the way we thought about the human experience. In 1859, in the midpoint of the 19th century, an English scientist, Charles Darwin, published his book, his magnum opus, on the origin of species, which changed forever how we thought about the origins of life here on Earth, entered new words into our vocabulary like evolution, adaptation, and we'll soon see how those ideas that Darwin saw in his studies of finches and tortoises on the Galapagos Islands will be harnessed and expressed in cultural terms to in many ways justify a world of haves and have-nots, to justify racism and campaigns of violence, imperialism, colonialism, big key trends of the 20th century. The world of Jack Johnson, a world where people of color like him are subject to violence, discrimination, racism, is a world of cultural values that were falsely informed by scientific studies that come from Charles Darwin. The whole ideology of social Darwinism, which we'll soon talk about in our lecture on imperialism, that can deeply inform and help you understand the study of figures like Jack Johnson and others we'll encounter in this class, comes from a cultural misappropriation, misuse of Darwin's ideas, where people will come to believe in this idea of survival of the fittest. So Charles Darwin changed not just our scientific understanding of the origins of human life, he inspired very ugly and repugnant visions of progress and change rooted in a misuse of his ideas to justify imperialism, colonialism, racism, haves and have-nots in the 20th century. A good example of how science influenced cultural values, albeit cultural values that we rightfully see as violent and repugnant. By the late 19th century, Louis Pasteur had changed our understanding of the origin of diseases. He fought his entire life to urge people to abandon long-standing beliefs that go back to the medieval period in regards to the origin of disease, and instead embrace this idea of germ theory, that there are these invisible pathogens that cause disease, that it would be a good idea to wash our hands and live in a more antiseptic world. For, again, hundreds, even thousands of years, human beings believed that disease was a function of bad smells or somehow angering the gods. Even through the 1800s, Pasteur and others, Joseph Lister, had to fight against that and convince people to embrace germ theory. Well into the late 19th century, surgeons and doctors around the world would perform operations without washing their hands. In the American Civil War, a war in which over 600,000 people will die, in the midpoint of the 19th century, surgeons performed amputations right there on the battlefield using the same instruments that they had used on a previous patient without cleansing those instruments or washing their hands. American presidents of the late 19th, even early 20th century were killed not by assassin bullets, but the treatment they experienced by doctors attending to those wounds. When James Garfield is shot, there's a doctor right next to him at a railroad station in Washington, D.C. You think, hey, that's great. You know, if you're going to be shot, you want a doctor right there. Instead, this doctor reached into the wound with his unwashed hand, infected Garfield, and he died not of the bullet wound, but of that infection given to him by a medical doctor. In the 1800s, the worst thing you could do was go see a doctor, right? Because not only did they not know to wash their hands or clean instruments, they were still using leeches on people into the late 1800s, convinced that fixing your body was somehow related to balancing your humors, the fluids in your body. So they would attach leeches to your body. They would try to get you to piss or shit or vomit to get the bad stuff out of you. Yeah, that's what you want, right? When you're already miserable, you go to the doctor and he gives you a laxative, right? But that was the state of medicine in the mid-19th century. It really isn't to the late 19th and early 20th century that germ theory does start to take root. And with it comes hope and progress for longer lives, healthier individuals, that we could conquer diseases that plagued humanity. So again, an invention, a way of thinking in terms of science, again, soon had cultural effects in convincing people that in the 20th century we could eradicate disease, that we could live long, healthy, prosperous lives. Again, we know that's not what happens. There was a massive pandemic, a global pandemic at the end of World War I, a flu pandemic that took the lives of people on every continent on Earth. Sounds strange, right? Yeah. Every 100 years now, I guess we can anticipate one. So we know that the 20th century ultimately would not be one where, through the widespread adoption of proper sanitary measures, wearing a mask, washing your hands would usher in a new and wonderful age of health and longevity. But when that century began, thanks to the impact of science, there were these cultural hopes that this too would be part of the narrative of human progress. I mentioned on the previous slide new inventions that transformed human life in the industrial world in the 19th century. We concluded with things like cinema and the automobile, and that's demonstrative of a big shift in the global industrial economy to consumer goods. And we'll talk a lot about consumerism in our class, as the global economy that develops in the 20th century is increasingly a consumer economy with the mass production of consumer goods, the selling of those goods around the globe. And with it came new experiences to watch a movie, to drive an automobile. And these inventions, again, were not just material goods. They seem to have great impact on our psyches and sensibilities, our ideals, hopes, and aspirations, the domain of culture. as more and more people could have these experiences. By the 1920s here in the United States, you could buy a Model T Ford for $220, meaning that even the poorest American, a urban laborer, a farmer, could experience the opportunities, the pleasures that come with the automobile. The automobile wasn't just a means of transportation. It symbolized freedom, mobility, a chance to engage with other pleasures and comforts of the market economy. Americans in the early 20th century could wear Levi's, drink Coca-Cola, and drive an automobile. And then through the course of the 20th and now 21st century, we've exported that consumer economy to the world, where people around the world wear Levi's, drink Coca-Cola, and eat McDonald's. So again, this is a story that awaits us as we traverse the 20th and make our way into the 21st century. And those developments aren't just technological and economic, they're also cultural. They also serve to condition people to believe that the good life could be at hand, generating visions of progress that are often deeply connected to the comforts and pleasures of the market economy. In the early 20th century, Albert Einstein changed how we thought about things that we imagined were abstract, natural, unchanging, time and space. He challenged our vision of a predictable world created by a great master in the clouds, a clockwork approach, and instead ushered in a vision of relativity that changed our notion of absolutes. Sigmund Freud, in the early 20th century, offered new, challenging ideas about human will, human motivation, arguing that there are deeply rooted, unseen forces embedded in our subconscious that account for our actions, changing how we thought about human intention, human will. We make rational choices. We take in information and act accordingly. Freud said, no, there are reasons that you don't even understand, that you don't even perceive, that explain who you are and how you behave. So Einstein and Freud changed our perceptions, our idea of truth. They created new sensibilities of change, of relativity, of things that are known and unknown. What we're talking about here in the slide are the cultural effects of new changes in technology, in trends, in the economy. What we're talking about here is how ideals and values changed. In our class here, History 20, it's very much about ideals and values. It's very much about culture. Yeah, we'll talk about big trends in the economy. We'll talk about trends in societies around the globe. Certainly talk about revolutions and wars. But we'll also talk a lot about values, ideals, hopes, aspirations. And those hopes and ideals and aspirations that define the 20th century indeed come out of these trends of the 19th century. I've warbled on a lot here. Originally, when I began this lecture, I hoped to conclude by talking about some political antecedents. We've talked about economic and technological antecedents, trends in the economy in the 18th and 19th century. We've now, in this slide, punctuated a number of key cultural antecedents, but I still have to talk about politics. So I'm calling audible here. I'm going to divide this first lecture in two. So let's stop here and transition into the second part of this lecture, the making of the 20th century, part 2, where we'll talk about political antecedents as, again, we rev up for the 20th century. So this will be a chance for you to take a break, take a drink. You probably need one at this point. And now open up our second part as I'll create another lecture, Making of the 20th Century, Part 2. So join me for that, as in that second part, we'll take a look at political developments in the 18th and 19th century that also, along with these cultural, economic, and technological trends, make the 20th century that is our focus. So let's pivot now to Part 2 of this lecture.